Now I'd like to introduce someone who plays a pretty vital role at the NDPC. Brent Barch is an NDPC Economic Policy Fellow. He writes monthly articles for us and generally helps with, helps us better understand economics and things like that. He is I believe he went to a summer seminar at Phi, the Foundation for Economic Education. He's a very, very bright young guy. But besides giving us this sort of intellectual background on economics and things like that, he does more than that. Every time you read an article produced by the NDPC, you can always tell if Brent has read it. If there are no grammatical errors, he's read it. If there are, that means he hasn't had time yet. We thank him for that. Brent, like Marty, challenges me to think about things in ways that I never have before. As I hone in on my personal beliefs and about economics and freedom in general and politics, I'll often give Brent a call, sometimes at 12:30, 1 o'clock at night, just to pick his brain. Brent is going to introduce our next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to NDPC Economic Policy Fellow, Brent Barch.
Sometimes I'm asleep when he calls, but don't always stay up that late. It's never easy to speak following Tom Woods, but I think you guys will find that Dr. Robert Murphy is more than up to the task. Indeed, Dr. Murphy is easily one of my favorite economists. In fact, his writings for the layman, which are as rich as they are plentiful, inspired me in part to study economics in the classroom. Today, the multi-talented Dr. Murphy will give two talks. One, which will be later this afternoon, is on energy policy, a topic that, while always important, is even more so in the face of radical new proposals to reshape the energy industry. This talk, however, is at least as serious. In the face of recession, political leaders always tend to react in ways that are not conducive to fixing the causes of the problems, instead focusing rather on the symptoms. Quite frankly, they often do things that exasperate the underlying problems in their quest to do something. In the midst of what we are currently experiencing, it is important to understand sound economics, and it is important to understand history as it actually happened. Take, for example, the Great Depression. Very few people know what really caused the Great Depression, and the version taught in the public schools goes something like this. President Hoover's laissez-faire approach to economics decimated the national economy. Thankfully, President Franklin Roosevelt saved the country by massively expanding the federal government. Two sentences. Could be all summed up. Dr. Murphy knows better, though. He understands that it was government intervention in the economy that led to the Great Depression, and that increased intervention prolonged the Great Depression, making it last well over a decade. We are pleased that he is here today to talk about the Great Depression, how it parallels with our current times, and what we can do to make things better. Dr. Murphy is an economist with the Institute for Energy Research, Senior Fellow of Business and Economic Studies at the Pacific Research Institute. He is the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and the recently released book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal. He holds an economics degree from Hillsdale College and a Ph.D. from New York University. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Robert Murphy.
Well, thank you, Brent, for that kind introduction. Glad to be here. I think I may have flown through North Dakota before, but I think this is the first time I've actually been in the state. And I will spare you references to the movie Fargo. I'm sure you guys get that a lot. But in all seriousness, this is now my new favorite state. Let me tell you two quick things. So last night, I flew in and I had a hectic time with the connection. The plane was delayed from Nashville to St. Paul, and I get in there, and I'm literally running through the airport, and I get up there, and I see the standby list up on the screen, and I get up there, and the guy at the counter says, "Mr. Murphy, I presume?" And I say, "Yep," and the woman standing there, her face just falls because she was standby, right? And so I said, "I'm sorry, I got to get this talk tonight." So anyway, I make that plan, I get here. So it was a hectic day, and at the dinner last night, I get in early to the the area where there was a dinner here last night. NDPC was hosting, not here at the hotel, and there's some energy people there and so forth. And we get in there, and the bartender's already there. It's an open bar, and I wasn't sure, because I had a hectic day. I needed to kick back and relax, but I didn't want to be the first. And I saw people were ordering like sparkling water, and so I was like, And then I saw one woman though had something that looked like wine, so I leaned over to the bartender and I said, "Is she drinking wine? Is it?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah." And I said, "Okay," because I wasn't sure if it was appropriate. And he just said, "This is North Dakota. Go ahead." So I said, "All right, this is my kind of state." And then later on after the talk, people are going. Back to to leaving and so forth, and the thing was winding down. So I thought, okay, everyone's going to go back to their room, and some of the NDPC people were like, "Oh no, let's head over to the hotel bar." I was like, "Okay," and I go in there, and there's a blackjack table, and I was just like, "This is like Christmas for me." So I didn't realize that you guys had it. So you should realize that, and also, of course, now I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is dangerous because I'm getting cash for these books I'm selling." So now tonight I'm going to go back to the hotel and have hundreds of dollars possibly in my pocket. So that should be an extra encouragement because I'll pump that money back into the North Dakota economy. And so, right. So I'll stay away from bashing Keynesian economics in this talk because I want you to believe that if I just spend enough money here, it'll help you guys. Okay, as Brian alluded to, it is actually a little bit. There's pros and cons following Tom Woods. So on the one hand, it gets you all fired up, and you just want to get up there and say, "Let's go, team! Come on, let's do it." We're losing 100-1, but there's plenty of time left in the game. Maybe we can come back. But on the other hand, it's a little bit intimidating because Tom's a really great speaker. Let me just tell you my favorite Tom Woods story. So we both participate in Mises Institute events, and I was down there for a conference. So my wife was with me. She happened to be inside the institute, and this young girl from overseas was there talking to me. She was very attractive, and she's talking to me, and I'm getting the sense she's flirting with me, like she's touching my arm and stuff. And so for you ladies here, if you're not flirting with a guy, don't touch his arm because we're very simple, and we go, "Oh, she must like me." All right, so you're much more complex than we are, so don't touch arms if you're not trying to signal something. Okay, so anyway, so she's doing this. She's telling me how much she loves my books, and I'm just the smartest guy in the world, and I'm thinking, all right, yeah, this is nice. And I actually start to feel guilty, like I'm not encouraging her, but except for my just persona and charm and whatnot, but I can't help that. But I'm thinking, if my wife walks this, because we're off. It's not like there's 50 people around. Like we're off by the table where the drinks are or something, and you guys are gonna think I'm a lush by the end of this talk. I'm not. I'm just. And so I'm worried, and that my wife's going to think something. But so, well, they pay me to socialize, and I'm here, so okay, I'm not. I'm just talking about economics. What drier thing could I do to sort of keep romance out of the discussion? But anyway, so I'm just feeling guilty. And so anyway, but then it comes down to she's like, okay, actually, can I go get? I just bought your book. Can I go get it and have you sign it? And I was like, oh sure. So she runs in. And then a few minutes pass, and she comes out, and she's really embarrassed, and she said, "I'm sorry, I thought you were Tom Woods." All right, and that's not. I'm not making that up for this talk. It really did happen. So I was just. So here I was mistaken for Tom Woods, and we had Tom Woods groupies hitting on me. So, and you can see the result. Like you understand, it was an understandable mistake. But okay, so before I forget, let me just a little commercial. This is my website, consultingbyRPM.com, or if you don't want to do it, just Google Free Advice, Robert Murphy. Free Advice is the name of my blog. It is free, and a lot of people, if you want to, that's where I keep track of stuff I do. I post articles. I write a lot of articles all over the place. So that's like the one-stop shopping if you want to keep track of things. So anyway, let me just give a little plug for that. So what am I talking about today? The Great Depression, the New Deal, and then, of course, the relevance for our economy today. I'm going to try to leave time at the end here, so let me just see what time we got. Okay, so I'm going to go, let's say about 40 minutes, and then I'll try to stop and leave time for Q&A, and then Brett, if we are, I might lose track once the Q&A starts, so cut us off if you feel like we need to stop, because if I'm fielding questions, I might lose track of the time. Okay, so let me, in these remarks, I want to go over some of the biggest misconceptions about what happened during the Great Depression, the New Deal, and I knew before doing research on this book, I had read things by Murray Rothbard and others debunking Larry Reed from the Mackinac Center, and they've got some of his pamphlets out there. So I knew the conventional history was wrong, but until I really got into the research for this book, it was shocking just how wrong it was. I mean, it's not just that, it's a little bit off. It is the complete opposite of what I think we've all been taught, what I was certainly taught growing up, and I'm sure many of you were, and the so-called lessons from the Great Depression that were being lectured on in the media when they say why the government's doing such and such because, oh, we all saw what happened in the 30s, which is a little bit ironic because at the same time, usually the typical press story the last year and a half has been the government or the Federal Reserve hasn't done this measure since the 1930s. And so it's like, well, if it was such a bad idea back then, why would we do it now, right? That the government policies back in the 30s, we had the worst depression in U.S. history, so why would we take lessons from the playbook of the 30s? And of course, the reason is that the conventional wisdom has it that for some reason capitalism just really screwed up in the 30s, and that's why we needed the U.S. to come the closest to central planning it's ever been. And that for some reason in the last few years capitalism really screwed up, right? So the point is, in the conventional wisdom, the government needed to step up to the plate in the 30s and then now because that's when it most needed to pull up capitalism, which had just let us down. So we shouldn't naively just look and say, when has the government been the strongest in U.S. history? 1930s and now. When was the economy the worst in U.S. history? 1930s and right now. And I'll talk a little bit later. It hasn't manifested itself right now yet, but I think things are going to get much, much worse. And then, naively, if you didn't know anything about economics and we're just being, raw statistician correlations, you might think, do you think maybe the size of the government has something to do with it? Maybe growing government is bad for the economy. I mean, we've got all sorts of examples that North Korea and South Korea, that's almost a laboratory experiment, and it looked like, the same people, the same culture. One went towards a command economy, one was relatively free. And certainly there's no question about which economy was more productive, or East Germany and West Germany. Certainly you can see, again, sort of like a laboratory experiment as far as these things go in economics. Again, hands down, which country's economy was stronger. And again, just hands down, okay, when was the U.S. government the biggest? The 30s, and then right now it's growing, and I think we'll see that looking back, I think 20 years from now, looking back, they'll say, when were the two worst periods in the U.S. economy? When was the U.S. economy mired in a recession, the most sluggish recovery? It would be the one in the 30s and the one right now. All right, and so fortunately, Tom has laid the groundwork of why does freedom work in general, and so I don't have to lay that groundwork for you here. I can just say we know going in we have this sort of, let's say, bias, this instinct that we think freedom tends to work, and if you have that and you go in and look at what happened in the 30s, it's no wonder that it was the worst economic performance in U.S. history. I mean, it's almost like, well, of course that would happen, given all the crazy things they did. All right, so the first major myth is that raw capitalism caused the Great Depression, and going hand in hand with that myth is that Herbert Hoover sat back and did nothing because he was this laissez-faire ideologue, and he was just devoted to the Constitution. He didn't think government served any role in helping the economy out of a depression with a small d, and that's why things got so awful that he then handed over to Franklin Roosevelt. Right? That's the conventional story. But even before we get into the actual details, on the face of it, that doesn't make any sense. Because no matter what Herbert Hoover did, no matter how laissez-faire you think he was, clearly U.S. presidents before him were just as laissez-faire, if not more so, during their depressions. Right? It's not that there were wild socialists in the White House, and then Herbert Hoover came along, and then scaled back big government from 1890. You see what I'm saying? It's not that Herbert Hoover drastically cut the size of government. So even the conventional history books, their story they're telling doesn't really make any sense, because the modern progressive, if you will, thinks that things were just awful in Neanderthal. Under the progressive era, things got a little bit better, but then it wasn't really until FDR came in with all the sweeping New Deal measures and reforms, things like Social Security and the SEC, things that are just obvious. Can you imagine the primitive state of the U.S. economy before we had the SEC and Social Security? Right? That's the mentality. But again, it wasn't like there was Social Security that Herbert Hoover then abolished. And so again, it begs the question, well, if it was Herbert Hoover's inaction that caused the Great Depression, why didn't previous presidents' inaction lead to things that were equally severe? All right, so just on the face of it, there's a little problem there. And then when we go in and actually look at the history, we'll see that not only was Herbert Hoover just as laissez-faire as the previous presidents during their respective depressions with a small d that we've never heard of. Right? It's funny, a lot of economists now who are defenders of FDR will try to point out that, oh no, things were bad before in earlier depressions, or they called them financial panics, and they'll try to point out things, but we don't. And I was just asking people, okay, well, the panic of such and such, 1873. Who was the U.S. president over that period? And nobody. I mean, Tom Woods would know. He's a historian, but people don't know who was president during 1921 depression. Now, some people might be able to back that out just because they know the succession of presidents. They might be able to figure it out because it's near World War I. But it's not that you associate Wilson or Harding with the 2021 depression, right? That those two don't go hand in hand in the conventional history. Whereas we all know that Herbert Hoover was responsible for the Great Depression, all right? And so my point is, the reason we don't know that is because those earlier depressions were not a big deal in terms of the annals of U.S. history, that typically they would last 2 to 3 years and they would be done with, all right? And the economy would be well on the road to recovery, and it would be ancient history. So it would be a bad 18 months, bad 36 months. Unemployment would go up. It would be much higher than it normally would be. But the economy would get through it, and it would move on. And so what happened, and again, I'm glad Tom laid the groundwork here, is you did have central bank or government interventions in the banking system that caused that boom-bust cycle that Tom described at the end of his talk. But precisely because the politicians in Washington back in those earlier periods, in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, because they didn't think it was the role of the government, or at least the central government, the federal government, to come in and actively take measures to help the economy through the Depression, that's why it recovered. So you did have the interventions that Tom talked about that caused the boom and then the bust, but it's like the master builder Tom talked about. If you don't try to get him drunk and you just sit back and let him realize, oh my gosh, the blueprints I had, this house I was trying to build, I realized I have 20% fewer bricks than I thought. Okay, well, he says, okay, what do we do? Well, you guys working on this patio here, you got to stop doing that. And you guys working on this gazebo, stop doing that. And this wing over here, this study I was going to build, so he revises the blueprints, makes the best of a bad situation, but now we can go ahead and finish the house. So there is a little bit of a readjustment. And there might even be, to extend this metaphor, there might be a few weeks at the work site when they're working on the house where some painters just had to lounge around because they were working on the gazebo that the original blueprint called for, but now they're unemployed. They're idle resources while they're adjusting to the fact that the master builder realizes, whoa, we don't have as many bricks as I thought we did, and so I have to revise the plans. All right, but as long as he knows the true situation, he revises the plans, gives everyone the right instructions, there might be, like I said, an adjustment period, and some of the workers might be unemployed on the work site for a few days while they're waiting. So the guys who are painting the gazebo, maybe now they have to wait for the more modest third story to be finished, and then go and paint that or something, okay? Because now the house isn't going to be as big as it used to be in the original plans. Okay, but so that metaphor, the more you think, it's actually a really good analogy for the economy as a whole. So in those earlier periods, yes, unemployment needed to go up, because in a market economy, who determines how many workers are in the housing sector, how many workers are making radios or TVs or what have you? That's all a decentralized decision, like Tom was talking about, and the market prices and the profit and loss guide that. There's no single central planner or team of central planners telling people where to go. And so when the economy hits a wall, when people realize we're at an unsustainable project here, or the economy as a whole is unsustainable, certain industries need to retract, certain firms need to fail, their workers all have to get laid off, and then so unemployment temporarily goes up, and then we say, okay, well, where should those workers go? Well, no individual knows that. Just like nobody knows how to make a pen, no individual person right now knows all these laid off quant guys at Wall Street hedge funds who are doing the models, valuing mortgage-backed assets and so forth. Those guys are out of jobs right now. Where should they go? Should they drive a cab? Should they move to North Dakota and deal at the blackjack table in the hotel? We don't know. Nobody knows that. Maybe some of those guys happen to be really good dealers, and so they should do it. Okay, so the way you would know that is the market price system. We leave it. It's a voluntary decision. So that's sort of the beauty of a market economy, is everything is voluntary, but there needs to be some way to give people the right information. So it can't just be that what if everyone wants to be a veterinarian and they all love animals? Well, everyone can't be a veterinarian because we'd all starve. Okay, but everyone can't just be a farmer if you want to also have homes and things and cars and so forth, right? So there needs to be ways to transmit to people the relative scarcities, and you can still do what you want. If you really want to be a veterinarian, even though you could do a different line with your skills and earn a lot more money, like maybe you could be a corporate lawyer too. Maybe you have that in you. You have the capability, but you don't want to be a lawyer. You want to be a veterinarian. That's fine. That's your choice. But the market price system at least tells you what the trade-off is. They're saying, well, you could be earning this much, or you could earn this much, and you could earn the lower amount. There's nothing in economics that says you need to go make as much money as you possibly can. That doesn't follow at all. But what economics does tell you is the market price system directs resources to where consumers value those services the most. Oh, Okay, so in a recession period, like Tom was talking about, that's sort of a cleansing process. That's when the market redirects idle resources, resources that were locked in the lines that they shouldn't have been. There is a brief period when unemployment goes up, when the suppliers of raw materials, all their buyers drop off, the demand for oil and other commodities falls, and so you would see prices tend to drop, and wages would tend to drop in order to clear that labor market, to get people who are laid off. They have to accept lower wages probably than what they were earning during the boom, so they can get a job somewhere else. Okay, and then the economy, cleanses out those malinvestments, and then we start on to healthy growth if the central bank didn't keep manipulating the interest rates. Okay, so that is basically what happened in previous depressions with a small d in U.S. history. And then it wasn't until Herbert Hoover comes along, though, that he says, no, that's unacceptable. And so what is it that Hoover does? Before I get into that, let me just read to you Hoover's thoughts on the matter. Okay, I'm sorry, before I get into this, let me just mention, I don't need to go into it because Tom did, but why did the crash happen? Why did the stock market crash happen in the first place? Again, it was the Federal Reserve. That during the 20s, the Fed pumped in a lot of money that it created out of thin air. In particular, in 1927, what had happened was the Bank of England was in trouble. Their gold reserves were getting drawn down, and gold was going into American vaults because, I got to make this very brief, but during World War I, Britain went off the gold standard. They printed up a bunch of paper pounds to pay for the war. And then after the war, though, Britain wanted to go back on the gold standard. And they went back, though, at the pre-war parity because of matters of prestige. They didn't want to officially devalue the pound. So they tried to link pieces of paper from the Bank of England back to gold at the same ratio that they used to redeem them at, how much gold they would give. I think it was 4.25 ounces per pound of gold before the war, right? So they were doing that, but then what happened, of course, is because they'd printed up so many pieces of paper, that was an unrealistic price after the war was over during the 1920s. So investors were turning over these pieces of paper to the Bank of England saying, we want gold. And then they were depositing them in U.S. vaults. And so you had this exodus of gold from Britain to the United States. If you're trying to stay on the gold standard, you can't have that persist because you're going to run out of gold. And pretty soon someone's going to present pounds, and they're going to say, we can't give you the gold because we're out of gold. So anyway, what happened is 1927, they realized this is really getting serious. Bank of England officials talked to the Federal Reserve officials, and they say, can you guys help us out? Can you cut U.S. interest rates? Can you print up more U.S. dollar bills? So that would reduce the pressure on the exchange rate. It would make the dollar-pound exchange rate more realistic, basically, if the U.S. inflated to try to catch up with how much Britain had inflated. And the Fed agreed to that. And so you can see that's really when the U.S. stock market takes off, is in 27 when the Fed cuts rates. And in the book I have quotes from Fed officials after the fact testifying before Congress, saying, that was the biggest blunder we ever made in 1927, that decision to really start, to cut interest rates and to start pumping money into the economy. Okay, so that's why the stock market goes, well, from your point of view, it goes up, and then in 29, then it crashes. So the question is not, so a lot of economists, even free market economists, they're trying to explain, why is it everything was going great, and then all of a sudden in 29 the floor falls out, and they try to point to Fed decisions in late 28 and early 29 of tightening, and that's what killed the stock market. And so that's what a lot of monetarists, people associated with the Chicago School, will tell you, and they're free market people, and so it fits in with their worldview that they're blaming it on silly bureaucratic mistakes to cause the stock market crash. But the Austrians say, no, it's not that the Fed stopped pumping in money at a fast enough rate in 29 and that's why it fell. The question really is, what caused the bubble in the first place? All right, because again, if you're looking at stock prices, they're going up at a decent rate, and then in 27 they really start shooting up, and then in 29 they come down. But it's not like they come down here. They just come down to where, if there had just been normal growth during the 20s, that's about how it would have been. Just like right now, home prices today are not particularly low in an absolute sense. Like if in 2001, somebody had said, oh, home price, the Case-Shiller index or whatever, in 2009 will be, I don't know the number off the top of my head, people wouldn't have been shocked and thought, oh my gosh, what happened to make housing get destroyed? They would have thought, okay, that's about normal, like projecting the rate of housing appreciation through the 90s to 2009. They would say, okay. Because the reason here now where it seems so painful is, again, the housing prices went way up at ridiculous double-digit rates year over year, and then now they're coming back down to areas that make more sense with the fundamentals in terms of rents and interest rates. All right, so that's similar thing happened in the 20s. The Austrian doesn't view it as what did the Fed do in 29 to kill the healthy boom, but rather says what did the Fed or the government do to cause this unsustainable boom in the first place in the late 1920s. Okay, so that's where the crash comes from the Austrian perspective. And then it would have been bad, and there would have been a few years of depression with a small d, just like previous times in U.S. history, if Herbert Hoover really had done nothing. But Hoover didn't do nothing. He did something. And let me just explain to you just some of his worldview and try to give you evidence that was the case. And of course, when I'm talking about the Great Depression, if I'm giving a lecture, what resource do I turn to? I turn to this thing right here. So for those of you who need to know about the Great Depression, I heartily recommend this book. So let me just lay the groundwork here. For those of you who are really getting into that, because of the blogosphere and so forth, economists are arguing this stuff, and everyone's making references to the Great Depression. And the single thing that really annoys me about this is people, because it's fine if somebody disagrees. You can have a disagreement. People could think, the government might do X, Y, and Z, and that would be a good thing. Okay, we can have that discussion. But there are people that are claiming Herbert Hoover was a self-proclaimed liquidationist. All right, I actually have seen, I won't mention his name, but I've seen an economist in a public lecture like this telling the audience what happened in the 30s was Herbert Hoover believed in liquidationism. That Herbert Hoover thought the way to fix an economy was to stand back and do nothing, just let the market cleanse itself out, and that's why things got so awful, because he had this view, just like the Republicans today have, right? That's the economist's point that I'm telling you about. And then to bolster his point, to not just assert that, but to show that he was getting it from history and he wasn't just making it up, he said, let me read to you a passage from Herbert Hoover's own memoirs, talking about what happened after the stock market crash. So I'm going to read that to you guys as well, and then we'll come back and we'll see what the economist of 2009 reading this passage was drawing a misleading interpretation. Okay, so again, this economist saying, look, let me prove to you folks that Herbert Hoover was a liquidationist. Here is Hoover in his memoirs describing what his Secretary of the Treasury said they should do after the stock market crashed. All right, so I'm reading the same quote that this guy read, and this is from Herbert Hoover's memoirs written after the fact. He's looking back after the stock market crash. So he said, okay, so this is Hoover now writing. After the stock market crashed, there were schools of thought within our administration. There was a leave it alone actually, I'll come back to this in a minute, but anyway, he says, I'm reading you too much, like I'm telling you with the part I'm reading, but the guy selectively gave this quote. So he said, okay, Secretary Mellon thought, government must keep its hands off and let the slump liquidate itself. Mr. Mellon had only one formula: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. He insisted that when the people get an inflation brainstorm, the only way to get it out of their blood is to let it collapse. He said it will purge the rottenness out of the system. High cost of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. All right, and that, I think, is where the economist I'm talking about stopped reading. And he said, basically saying, so folks, that was the mindset back in the 30s. Can you imagine the heartlessness? Okay, and then he moved on. And so I caught myself, because he actually, what I was going to read to you that I have in my quote was the sentence before that, was Hoover saying, after the stock market crash, two schools of thought quickly developed within our administration discussions. First was the leave it alone liquidationists headed by my Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon. And then he went on and said that. Okay, then the paragraph, it's even on the same page in Hoover's memoir, so it's not like the guy I'm talking about just didn't turn the page. Coming right after this, he says, this is Hoover now talking, I, of course, reminded the Secretary that back in the 1870s, when Mellon had said that the liquidationism worked, an untold amount of suffering did take place, which might have been prevented, that our economy had been far simpler 60 years ago when we were 75% an agricultural people, contrasted with 30% now, and the now being 1929. That unemployment during the earlier crisis had been mitigated by the return of large numbers of the unemployed to relatives on the farm, and that farm economy itself had been largely self-contained. But he, meaning Mellon, shook his head with the observation that human nature had not changed in 60 years. Secretary Mellon was not hard-hearted. He felt there would be less suffering if his course were pursued. The real trouble with him was that he insisted that this was just an ordinary boom slump. Okay, so I'm trying to come up with a metaphor and an analogy to show you how dishonest it is when people say Hoover was a liquidationist, and they quote, in his memoirs, the point of that is Hoover is telling the reader, Mellon was telling me to be a liquidationist, but I told him he was crazy. That was too much suffering. I was not a liquidationist, and look what I did. Okay? So whether you agree with Hoover's policies or not, and it's fine if you want to say, oh, he didn't go far enough, he was too timid. Okay, that's fine. But you can't read the quote when he's making fun of a liquidationist to prove that he was a liquidationist. Right? I guess I'm trying to come up with an analogy. That'd be like saying, I disagree with U.S. foreign policy in the 1980s. In fact, even Ronald Reagan admitted that the U.S. was an evil empire. That would be about analogous. And you say, no, he didn't. He said it was the Soviet Union. He said, oh, you think what the U.S. did in the Iran-Contras in Nicaragua, you think that wasn't the actual evil empire? I mean, that's what these guys do, is you say you can't quote one thing and then they'll ignore it, and then they'll just start talking about all the bad things Hoover did. And it's like, that's irrelevant. You can't use his own words against him like that. Okay. So let me move on. So what did Herbert Hoover do? The single worst thing he did in terms of causing the Great Depression, what turned it from a normal small D depression into the great one, was after the stock market crash, he calls in all the big business leaders. And he tells them, I don't want you to cut wage rates. Because Hoover, and in the book I document it better than I'm going to have time to do here, but Hoover was of this mindset. He had this newfangled theory that other economists had been coming up with. It's not that Hoover dreamed it up out of thin air. During the 20s, that there was this new economics coming into vogue that said the reason you've got these boom slump periods is that for some reason the market economy's humming, then there's a little hiccup for some reason, we don't know why, but just there's a shock. That's the economist's favorite explanation for things. Oh, there was a shock. It's very easy to be an economist, actually. You just talk about shocks. And so there was a shock, and then what happened is it's self-perpetuating, that businesses, the people stop buying their product. So what does the individual business do in his own self-interest? Well, he cuts wage rates or he starts laying off workers. Oh, but see, that might be smart for the individual business. If everything else were the same, you enhance your bottom line by cutting your workers' wages and laying off people. But if every business is doing that during the beginning stages of a downturn, it just makes things all that much worse, right? Because now the very people you're hoping come in and buy your product, they don't have any money because all the other businesses are cutting their wages and they're laying off people. And so the idea is all these businesses are collectively stupid, that if they could all just agree not to cut wages, the stock market crash would have just been a little blip and then business would have gone back to normal. The roaring 20s would have blossomed into the roaring 30s. And so Hoover thought, but what will mess that up is if all you business people get scared by the stock market crash and you foolishly start cutting wages and so on, things that are individually rational but collectively suicidal. Right? So that was what Hoover thought. And that sort of makes sense. That's in fact what you'll get if you watch CNBC or read the newspaper talking about today. Like that's what they think, the way they got to prop up demand and so on. So it was understandable, but that was the single biggest thing as to why it turned into the Great Depression, because back then the U.S. was still on the gold standard. And I don't have time to really get into that now. Again, if you want to talk about that during the break, that's fine. But very briefly, what happened was, because of the fractional reserve nature of our banking system, as I'm sure you all know, when you go to the bank and you put in a $1,000 deposit, they don't put it in a little vault with your name on it, right? They only keep some of it on deposit and they loan out the rest, right? So at any given time, the total amount of outstanding checking account balances is far greater than how many green pieces of paper there are in the system, okay? And so what that means is if everyone gets panicked and starts taking their money out of the banks, the total money supply shrinks, right? Because if you go and say, give me $1,000, my checking balance says I have $1,000 with your bank, I want it in cash. The first few people who show up and just ask it, they say, okay. And so they pay the people back. And so the point, again, is there's a much smaller number of green pieces of paper than there are the total outstanding checking balances. The more people suck their money out because they want it in actual cash, because they're afraid the banks are going to fail, that shrinks the money supply. Banks have to call in loans that they advance. They have to stop advancing new loans because their cash reserves are shrinking because of all the withdrawals. All right, so that's why, for those of you familiar with Milton Friedman's explanation of why things got so bad, that's why prices started falling so drastically from 29 onward, is because people were sucking their money out of the banks. It was not that the Federal Reserve consciously said, you know what, the economy's suffering, why don't we suck out a third of the money from the money supply? That's not what happened. What happened is people's own behavior was reducing the money supply, and according to Milton Friedman, the Fed didn't do enough to offset that. All right, that the Fed could have prevented that, but it wasn't that the Fed consciously chose. Because what happened is from 29 to 33, the outstanding amount of money that people had to spend, that shrank by about a third. Right? So that's a pretty drastic fall. So when you want to understand why is it that prices fell so much, well, that was a big part of the explanation. People had less money to chase the goods, and so that's why the prices came down. All right, so that's what's going on. So if you think about it, precisely the time when prices are falling, they were falling about 10% a year once it really got underway in terms of a year-over-year rate. The highest it got to about 10%. So when you have the prices of everything falling fairly drastically, the one price that's not falling is the wage rate, because Hoover, first of all, called on all the big business leaders and said, don't cut wages. And also, it wasn't just the bully pulpit. He also had deals with unions and so forth, where it was in a business person's interest. He would get relieved from certain things the government could do to him if he capitulated and didn't cut wage rates. Right? So there's lots of pressure the White House brought to bear on businesses so they would keep wage rates up. So what happened is you had wages roughly staying the same, or at least falling very slowly, while everything else is getting cheaper. So if you're a business person, what does that mean? That your profits are down, your prices that you can charge for your product are falling, but you can't cut wage rates. So what happens is you cut back on the number of people you hire. Or if you're a business that just goes out of business, all your workers are now laid off, they're looking for a job, they can't get hired elsewhere because those people, the labor is far too expensive, right? So what happened is actually, if you kept your job during the Depression, the first few years of it, your take-home pay in terms of the prices of everything else and how much you could actually buy with your paycheck rose more quickly than it had during the Roaring '20s, right, for the people that kept their job. But of course, what that meant was because productivity was falling, it wasn't like workers were producing more stuff, and because worker productivity was dropping because the economy was collapsing and there was the malinvestments of the boom period. So what that meant was that fewer and fewer workers could get hired because their price was being artificially propped up above the market clearing level, and that's why unemployment went up to 25% in 1933. It just kept getting higher and higher. So that was by far the worst unemployment before or since in U.S. history. And it's not, you say, why did that happen? Well, because Economics 101, they weren't letting the wage rate fall, and so there was a surplus. The wage rate was well above what it would have been in the market. During the Depression of 1920 to 21, in a 1 year period, wages fell 15%. And that, Herbert Hoover, that had horrified him, and he talks about that he was trying to avoid the suffering that the workers bore during the 2021 Depression when their wages in a single year got cut by 15%. And that was bad, for sure. But unemployment went up to about 12%. Then the next year it was down to about 6%. The next year it was down to 2.5% by 1923. Right, so that's why the Depression of 2021 was over within 2 years, because wage rates fell, the labor market cleared, and prices also fell very quickly in that period as well. Okay, so you see what happens is wages fall, clear in earlier ones. It wasn't until the Great Depression that Hoover kept them up. Just checking our time here. Okay, so that's the single biggest thing that Hoover did. Let me to show you, and again, I can't emphasize enough, that was a break from the past. So whether you think that was a good idea or a bad idea, the point is Hoover telling business leaders do not cut wage rates. And actually, I misspoke a minute ago. Wage rates fell 20%. It was prices that fell 15% in the 2021 Depression. All right, so paychecks fell 20%. That wasn't as shocking as it sounds to us because prices in general also fell not as much. But the point is labor became relatively cheaper during the 2021 Depression, and that's why unemployment didn't go up so drastically. It went up briefly, but wages fell, so all the unemployed workers were able to get jobs. That didn't happen from 29, 30, 31, 32. These largely men were just out of work, couldn't get rehired because the employers were afraid to lower the wage rates at which it would have made sense for them to hire some of these men back. Okay, so again, this is unprecedented. This is a brand new thing. And let me just read you some quotes to try to get you to see that. So here, for me, my favorite quote on this point is to read from because you might say, well, sure, Herbert Hoover, after the fact in his memoirs, paints himself as an interventionist because he's trying to pass the buck. He wants to, excuse himself from it in the eyes of history. But maybe during the fact, he really was just following the laissez-faire policies of the past. But no, here is a labor union editorial. So this is from the American Federationists, which was a labor union publication. And this is from January 1st, 1930. All right, so the stock market crash was in October of 29. almost immediately, Hoover calls on all the big business leaders and has periodic meetings with them. He also established joint business government, I forget what they were called, cooperatives or something like that, where meetings that each business person would appoint a representative who would go to Washington and meet at these councils, and they would discuss their coordinated response to the Depression. Because of course we don't want to have the dog-eat-dog world of the past where everyone's for himself. We need to collectively decide how we're going to deal with this thing and be scientific and rational, not individual money-grubbing capitalists. All right, so that was the idea. So the labor unions were all big fans of this, especially in the early stages before unemployment broke double digits and then broke over 20%. In the beginning, this was great. That, oh, what a compassionate guy we have in the White House. So here's what the labor union editorial said of Hoover January 1st, 1930. The President's Conference has given industrial leaders a new sense of their responsibilities. Never before have they been called upon to act together. In earlier recessions, they have acted individually to protect their own interests and have intensified depressions. Okay, so again, the labor unions are praising who we have been taught is this mean-spirited, anti-labor liquidationist guy. It seems odd the labor unions would be praising him if that's what his philosophy and policies were. And then the last quote I'll give you on this one, again, just to show you that it really was something special that Hoover was doing in terms of trying not to let wages fall. But this isn't just a little footnote. This was a big deal at the time, and he really thought this was a new type of medicine to get the economy through a depression with much less suffering. So this is Secretary of Labor James Davis, so Hoover's secretary, from May 1930. He says, there never has been a crisis such as we have had as the stock market crashed that threw millions out of employment, that there wasn't a wholesale reduction in wages. So he's saying never before have we had a crash like this, throwing out millions of people at work where normally wages would have fallen. He said, but now things are different. If Hoover accomplishes nothing more in all of his service to the government, that one outstanding thing of his administration, no reduction in wages, will be a credit that will be forever remembered, not by the working classes alone, but by businessmen as well. Because without money in the pay envelopes, business is the first to suffer. All right. So again, the mentality being that it's a great thing Herbert Hoover is not letting wages fall. So okay, let me move on in the interest of time here. But you can see that's the single biggest thing when people say, why did the Depression get so bad? And Hoover did all kinds of awful things. But in terms of, because what happens is, and that's why I think today I'm very pessimistic about the future, if the government comes in and sabotages the market's recovery process, for example, by not letting wages fall, and then it starts to linger, and then people start to panic, and they start thinking, uh-oh, capitalism doesn't work anymore, and that gives the government the pretext to pile on more and more interventions, right? Just like now, the longer this current slump lasts, the more now the Obama administration is going to do. It's not that they're going to say, well, we've tried intervention, let's give the free market a chance. No, they're going to say, I can't believe it. First the banks don't work, now the car companies don't work, and of course 3 years from now they're going to be saying, these greedy healthcare providers, I can't believe they're rationing the services they give to people, that's just crazy. When they're not going to realize, no, it's because of your interventions that are causing these problems. All right? So I think, the big picture, what the heck happened in the 30s, I think it was because Herbert Hoover's high wage policy or maintenance of wage policy allowed unemployment to get to unprecedented levels, and everyone's panicking. A lot of the laissez-faire economists of the day are saying, no, the government doesn't need to do anything. The market will fix itself, and by the way, you should let wages fall. And so the average person and a lot of the policymakers are concluding, these laissez-faire economists are saying we should just let this run its course. But look, we're already 3 years into this thing. Unemployment's over 15%. This is awful. We need to do something. The capitalism has failed. Capitalism may have worked in the past when we were a bunch of farmers, but not now in the modern industrial economy of the 1930s. Right? That was the kind of language they were using. So my point is, the longer the slump persists, the government comes, and it's not even necessarily like a conspiracy theory, but if you're a politician in office, you don't want to go out on the podium and say, don't worry folks, let's just let things persist and let your wage rates fall and things will be fine. You can't say that, right? And you're certainly not going to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to cut government spending, lay off a bunch of government workers, and then we'll cut your taxes and that will return resources to the private sector. I mean, that's not politically popular. No politician is going to run on that. All right, so it's in the nature of it that government, of course, the phrase now, you don't let a crisis go to waste, you always seize the opportunity. So I mean, whether you have a conspiratorial mind that you think these politicians are behind closed doors going, let's come up with more reasons to take over different sectors, or whether you think they're legitimately trying to help people, The point is, the type of person that spends his or her career in politics now is not going to be a laissez-faire capitalist. They're not going to believe that the market works, because then there's no reason for them. Because then, if you want to go into public service, you'd be a waiter. You'd really serve people, right? If you wanted to, all right. You wouldn't think that the way I'm going to help my fellow man is to, be a parasite on them and earn my living through taxes, and then give a bunch of speeches and demonize the people that are paying the taxes in the first place. The business is earning the revenue. Okay, so the point is that's where they happen. But just a few more things that Hoover did that were just incredibly silly. He jacked up. So first of all, he engaged in massive deficit spending. So that's another myth that people, and they use the phrase, "Well, let's not go back to Herbert Hoover economics." And what they mean by that is, let's not try to balance the budget. So Paul Krugman, and the thing, I have a great excerpt from Paul Krugman literally saying that it was in December of 2008. He had a New York Times column where he was warning us about, let's not go back, let's not have the attack of the 50 Herbert Hoovers. And he was saying that state governments today need to not worry about their deficits. They need to keep their public spending up, because even though it's rational for the individual state government to think it needs to tighten its belt when its revenues or tax receipts are falling, no, because the economy is suffering from a drop in aggregate demand. And so you need government to step in and fill the gap, because private consumers are being too silly and they're afraid to spend. That was Krugman's message. And to bolster that with the lessons from the Great Depression, Krugman pointed to the 30s and said, Herbert Hoover showed us what happens when you try to balance a budget in the middle of a depression. And so that just ends the story. Well, gee, if Herbert Hoover did it, that's a bad thing to do. But what Hoover did, it's true, in 1932, his advisors and so on were saying, the deficit's really getting big, we better cut that a little bit. But the reason the deficit was such a concern was because it had risen to a record level for peacetime. So they borrowed more during World War I, but beyond, and probably the Civil War too, but other than that, the deficit that Herbert Hoover was running to try to fix the Depression in 1930, 31, 32 was record levels, just for the government to be doing that without some enemy invading the country or whatnot. So just think like massive public works spending programs, the Hoover Dam, for example. It actually had the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which spent ultimately over $2 billion trying to prop up banks and other institutions that were failing. And this was back when $2 billion was a lot of money. Right? And so, things that I put in the book, that if you had grabbed a bunch of high school seniors and you said, a U.S. president during the 1930s started the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, gave it its first year of operation over $1 billion to prop up banks that had made bad investments during the 20s, which president do you think that was? I think they would all say, oh, it must have been Franklin Roosevelt. That sounds like a New Deal thing. Well, no, that was Herbert Hoover, the guy we were told did nothing. All right, so and what's scary doing research for this book is all the stuff they were doing is exactly the sorts of things that first George Bush was doing and now Obama is amplifying. So when people say, to try to praise Obama, that, oh yeah, Bush was like Hoover and now Obama's like FDR, we say, yes, that's true, and the last time we had Hoover and FDR, we had 10 years of depression. So why is that a good thing? That should scare us. Warning bells should go off when someone says Obama's like FDR. So let me get into that. Okay, I need to speed up here. Let me get into that. So is it true that FDR and the New Deal got us out of the Depression? Well, it's true, and depending on when you classify the Depression as ending, a lot of people, and economists too, would say it ended with World War I, and I'll come back. That'll be the last point that I touch on, is did World War II get us out of it? But with the conventional statistics of GDP and unemployment, yes, the Depression ended when Franklin Roosevelt was still the president. He was still in the White House, and so in that tautologist sense, FDR got us out of the Depression. All right, but to credit him, what you really want to say is, would the Depression have lasted longer or shorter had they followed policies other than the New Deal? So there's no way you can directly answer that question. It's not just a matter of looking in the history books, because we don't know what the alternate timeline would have been if FDR had won the election and instead he had said, you know what, let's cut spending, let's lower taxes, let's do all these other things and return the economy to the private sector. What would history have been like in that alternate timeline? And so we don't know. But we can get a good idea. We can ask, well, what happened when FDR was in office? Well, just to give you one data point, he was sworn in 1933. 5 years later, 1938, the unemployment rate that year averaged 19%. Okay, so 5 full years after the New Deal was in full swing, because remember we had the 100 days. It wasn't like FDR got in and putzed around for 18 months. I mean, right away he went to work saving the economy. So 5 full years after the New Deal is in place, the unemployment rate that year averaged 19%. So that's not a particularly stellar record of economic improvement to pull us out of the recovery. Remember, previous depressions and subsequent recessions, because we don't call them depression anymore, that's impossible, they are typically within 2 to 3 years they were over with. And yet 5 full years after FDR takes over to save capitalism from itself, you still had an unemployment rate of 19%, which would, right now an unemployment rate of 19% would be inconceivably bad. But the apologists for FDR will say, well, look what he had to work with. When he came into office, unemployment actually that month was about 28%. So 19% is awful, but it was 9 points lower than when he first took over. So but again, the point is, it shouldn't have taken 5 years for it to fall like that. In previous ones, the depression would have been ancient history. So what's the next response they'll give you is they'll say, well, you can't look at previous depressions because they weren't as bad as the situation that FDR inherited. Herbert Hoover had so screwed up the U.S. economy and then handed it over to Roosevelt that it took longer to dig out of that hole than it would have. You can't just extrapolate and look at, in the book, for example, I say, how fast did unemployment fall during the 20 and 21 depression? So it got up to 11.7%. 2 years later, it was down to 2.5%. Right? So that's a 9-point fall in 2 years of the unemployment rate. So that's why I'm saying, well, so when Roosevelt took over at 28%, like it should have, you could see, calculate how far after 5 years, plenty of time given how fast the economy had rebounded from the last bad depression. If FDR had merely had the same success in recovery as Harding had, and then Coolidge, right from the earlier period. You follow what I'm saying. So again, FDR's apologists will say, no, that's an unfair comparison because it's not just a matter of, it's not a linear increase that the unemployment rate was twice as high, and so you give them twice as much time, you have to give them a lot more time. But even there, I said, okay, let's look at the U.S. unemployment compared to Canadian unemployment during the 30s. And because that is you're comparing apples to apples. You're saying, okay, they were both in the worldwide Great Depression. So if it's true that FDR was really great and pulled the U.S. Away from the brink of disaster, then surely the U.S. should have recovered more quickly from its Great Depression than Canada recovered from its Great Depression. But you don't see that at all. That the unemployment rate, the difference between the U.S. rate and the Canadian one, that gap grew by 2 percentage points after FDR took over. So let me I know it's with just my words instead of seeing the numbers, it's hard to catch that. Let me say it differently. So if you look at under the Herbert Hoover administration, U.S. unemployment was higher than the Canadian rate. They both, of course, went up as the years went on, and it was about, on average, 3.9 points higher. Then if you look at from 1934 to 41, the pre-war period when you got the New Deal in place, U.S. unemployment was 5.9 points higher on average than the Canadian unemployment rate. Okay, so the gap between the two got bigger under the New Deal than under the awful Herbert Hoover economics. All right, so again, what we're trying to answer is, what would it mean to say FDR got us out of the Depression or his policies were a good thing? Again, we don't know that ultimately because we can't go back in time and change the policies and then let the time machine go forward and see what would have happened. But we can ask, did the economy recover more slowly or more quickly under him than under any previous or subsequent U.S. recession? The answer is no. That was by far the most sluggish recovery in U.S. history. And then even comparing it to the Canadian experience at the same time, it was a more sluggish recovery. All right. So yes, unemployment rates did come down under FDR, but the point is they fell more quickly in Canada with whatever their policies were. And it's not that they had the Canadian Northern Deal or something like that, right? It wasn't that Canada had even bolder New Deal measures than FDR instituted. All right, so again, no matter how you slice it, unless you're just going to use the tautology of FDR was in office when the Depression ended, therefore he rescued us from it, then you can see that it crippled the economy. So specifically, what sort of things did FDR do? And I can't, obviously with time constraints, get into it too much. But let me just, broadly speaking, he raised taxes, massively increased government spending. And so why is that a bad thing? Well, because precisely when the economy is on the ropes, when you have, again, the analogy of the master builder, when he realizes he's out of bricks, or he doesn't have enough bricks, that he thought he did, if right then you said, what if now a bunch of vandals, some teenage hooligans come in the middle of the night and start taking a sledgehammer and breaking a bunch of the bricks? The worst thing in the world would be for that to happen when a guy was already under the misconception of how many bricks he had, right? That during a normal time, if he knew the right number of bricks and the hooligans came in and wrecked, a few hundred bricks, that wouldn't be a big deal, right? But if you're already in the point where, oh my gosh, we've been building this thing for 3 months under this misapprehension of how many bricks we have, that's a really bad time for some hooligan to come in and start destroying what little resources you actually do have to work with. So that's what FDR, following in the footsteps of Herbert Hoover, was doing. Is he was increasing deficit spending, taking resources that otherwise would have been available for the private sector to sort of plug the leaks, repair the damage, and siphoning them away and having the government spend them on anything that moved. Now, so we can sort of give you the raw economics, but that's a little bit dry. So that is true. I do have a chapter just giving you, the broad theme. Why is it that the New Deal did not work? Why did it sabotage the recovery process and lead to the longest recovery in U.S. history from a downturn? So I can explain it to you that way, but that's a little dry for some people. And just to give some of the flavor, I have another chapter in the book called The Outrages of the New Deal, where it's not just that, oh, these things were misguided policies and they may have led to bad outcomes. No, I mean, some of the stuff that happened was just outrageous. And when you read in the history books about he founded the TVA and the NRA and all these alphabet soup agencies, it's very sort of sanitized, right? It seems like it's almost as if FDR is just giving nice fireside chats and recommending things to businesses. Like, maybe you guys should do it this way, but just that's my recommendation. Take it or leave it. That's not what happened, of course. The way FDR rammed these things through was, not to be too demagogic, but at gunpoint, right? If you didn't do the stuff he said, you went to jail. And that meant people with guns showed up and took you to jail. And there were cases that I talk about in the book where, guys would be, a tailor would be sewing pants and charging his customers a certain amount for that service, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, would come in. The big businesses, in conjunction with the labor unions in that industry, would set a code of fair competition. They would set minimum prices for what you could charge as a tailor when someone brings you pants that need to be sewed. And so this one business person who'd been in business for 30 years, this little guy had a little shop, and he was saying, no, the way I stay in business, the way I compete with the big boys is I undersell them. I charge less to sew a pair of pants. And people showed up at his place of business and said, you have to stop doing that. You're breaking the law. You're not charging your customers enough. And again, this is in the middle of the 1930s when everyone's out of work. His crime was not charging his customers enough. And he said, somewhat foolishly, that he could charge whatever he wanted, that it was free country. And no, he actually said to him, well, I'm going to charge this, and you can take me to jail if you think you can, or something like that. And so they took him to jail. Right? He was, again, thinking that he was in a country of free enterprise when at that point he wasn't. All right? So there's all kinds of cases like that. But again, it's another example. When people say, "Oh, FDR should have took us off the gold standard. It was a good thing," and you read now about that, and it makes it sound like it was just a mere little policy change. When the way that happened, because it wasn't just enough to take the U.S. off the gold standard to mean that when people presented green pieces of paper to give gold in exchange, they didn't merely end that. FDR wanted to completely wean the country off of using gold, and so what did he do? Under penalty of a $10,000 fine and jail time, everyone in the country had to turn in their gold, and there was exceptions, like if you had jewelry and coins of numismatic value, you didn't have to turn those in. But if you held gold as an investment, as an asset, you had to turn that in under threat of serious penalties. And that's actually why they built the gold bullion depository at Fort Knox, was to house all the gold that FDR basically stole from the American people. That's you steal all that gold, you got to put it somewhere, and let's build Fort Knox, or the depository at Fort Knox. Right? So things like that, these weren't just mere little policy changes; they had to back them up through the force of law. Okay, the last myth I want to talk about, and then I'll go to the Q&A, is the idea that it wasn't FDR that got us out of the Depression; it was World War II. So there's a bunch of things wrong with this. The first is, typically I hear that, and it's fine when I'm promoting the book on doing radio shows, and you can tell the difference. Like, some hosts have actually read the book and they're talking about, oh yeah, I love this part of it. And you could, whereas other ones you can tell they have the bullet points that the publisher sends. And I'm not making fun of them. I mean, they're busy and they can't, they get a guest on the last minute. They don't have time to read the book. I'm not criticizing that, but I'm just saying you can tell the difference between hosts that have read the book or not. And some of them, it's funny. They will say to me, they'll say, "Okay, next, folks, after the break, we've got Robert Murphy," and then they get me on. And now, Dr. Murphy, it wasn't this big Keynesian New Deal spending of FDR. It was World War II, wasn't it? And it's a little bit awkward because I want to be nice. The guy's trying to hawk my book, so I want to be nice to him. But no, I mean that's wrong. That's what I say in my book. But it's not just that I disagree with that. It's that think about it, that doesn't make any sense. How can you, as a right-wing conservative who hates FDR, how can you say FDR was wrong for thinking big government spending, public works spending, and drafting men into the Civilian Conservation Corps to plant trees and build schools? How can you say that's not good for the economy? But you say what really does help the economy is to spend 10 times as much building tanks and bombers and drafting men into the army and shipping them overseas where they're going to get maimed and to blow all that stuff up, right? I mean, if spending money per se is there, and the government commandeering resources and imposing rationing and price controls and all sorts of controls over resources, that's what happened during World War II. If you think that worked, then you're admitting with Paul Krugman and other Keynesians that the reason the New Deal didn't work in the 30s was that FDR just didn't push it far enough. Right? You're agreeing to the fact that big government spending is the way to jumpstart an economy. All right, so that's what I'm saying. Like on the face, there's a little bit of a tension there. If you want to say the New Deal was a stupid idea, it was World War II. Because in terms of the economic impact, World War II was just like the New Deal, but times 10. So specifically, what did happen? Why was it that the economy apparently did rebound during World War II? Well, there's a lot going on here. Let me just focus on a few things, then I'll stop for Q&A. So the most obvious thing is unemployment fell. Right? If you look at the unemployment figures, they were still high, double-digit rates going into 1941, and then they fall like a rock right after the U.S. really enters the war and starts drafting people. And so it looks like that's really what secured things. And people say, oh yeah, because they think it's the demand for wartime goods and women were getting sucked into the labor markets, and that was all true. But in terms of why the unemployment rate fall, well, what did the government do? It took millions of men, put them on boats, and shipped them across the ocean. And then lo and behold, there were fewer unemployed men in America, and so the official unemployment rate fell. And so right now, if President Obama wants to lower unemployment, he could just round up a bunch of people and say, go fight some pirates across the ocean, right? And that would lower the measured unemployment rate if you stopped counting those people as being so that's obviously not an indicator of economic recovery, the fact that they just got rid of a bunch of people. All right, so that's one thing, one reason why it's misleading. Another thing that actually was legitimate, so a reason that the war actually did help the economy is FDR's advisors came to him and they said, look, we need big business to be on our side on this. We need their participation. They need to retool the factories. Instead of making cars, they got to start cranking out tanks, bombers and so on, making munitions. And you've been demonizing business so much. And in the book I showed, it wasn't like FDR said, I'm going to raise taxes on the rich. He just demonized them. Like the rich are responsible. That's why we're in this depression. I want it to be said of my administration that the money lenders met their match under me. Right? So that was the mentality. So business people were just terrified of him. And I have surveys in there showing a lot of business people thought FDR was going to declare himself dictator. Right? And you could say, oh, that's crazy. But I mean, before FDR, no president had served more than 2 terms. And yet FDR was. And around the world, collectivism was becoming more popular. That you had all sorts of dictators. And their economic worldview was not that much different from FDR. So don't miss. I'm not saying FDR was Hitler or Stalin. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying their economic views were not so different. All right. And so the point is, FDR had to stop that when he really needed the war industries to kick in. He needed the war production, and so he got rid of some of the most ideological left-wing college professors who had held chief posts in the early stages of the New Deal. He cleaned out some of those really crazy left-wingers and put in people in key posts for procurement and so on that actually had been businessmen, right? So that they knew, oh, I know this guy in the steel industry, he can trust me. Because what happened is the business people were so afraid of the government, they didn't even want to sign a contract with the military to say, okay, we'll produce so many tanks, even at inflated prices. because they were afraid, 18 months later, the government, FDR would get up in front of, in the radio and start demonizing them and say, I can't believe they're trying to profiteer in the middle of a war, right? The business people were so used to him flipping on them and blaming them for everything that they were afraid to even sign lucrative military contracts. So that's why he had to clean house and get rid of some of the really crazy anti-business people and put in people that businesses trusted. So that was actually one respect in which business legitimately, or the economy legitimately, did get better because of the war. But other than that, what does the war do? It siphons resources from the private sector. Instead of making homes and cars and radios, you're making tanks, bombers, munitions, shipping them across the ocean and blowing them up, right? That can't be good for the economy. So ultimately, people say, well, what was it that fixed the Depression? I follow the argument of Bob Higgs, who says that what it was is 1946 is really the recovery. That if you look at the private share of gross domestic product, that kept shrinking even during the war. Right? Even during the war years, the private component of GDP kept getting smaller and smaller, even under the government's official figures, because the military was sucking so many resources away from the private sector. But in 1946, when FDR's gone, now it's Harry Truman, and you have the New Deal is officially over, the war's ended, the government lifts price controls, all sorts of government interventions get pulled back, government spending comes way down. You see the biggest single-year jump in private GDP in U.S. history in 1946, when a lot of Keynesian economists were predicting that, now we're going to go back into the misery of the Depression, because they thought it was the big spending of the war years that had pulled us out of it. Now if the government stops spending, we're just going to go right back to 1939. But that isn't what happened, obviously. The late 40s and the 50s were a boom period. Right, so that sort of dispels the idea that it was the big spending per se that got us out of the Depression. Okay, let me stop there, and then again, Brett, just cut us off when you think we need to stop. Yes, sir.
What early and later steps would you advise in moving toward a market-based health system in the United States?
Okay, so the question is, what will we do to get towards a market-based health system?
I mean, something that's acceptable to the average guy. The early steps, this toward this, and then next.
Healthcare is not my area of expertise, so I'm not sure exactly what you would do. The problem is, so it's true that it's government intervention, I think, that is why healthcare is in such a strange situation. So, for example, why is it that our healthcare is tied to our employers for a lot of us? That itself was partly a relic of the wage and price controls of World War II, that a lot of employers, the government made it illegal for them to bid up wages because, again, during World War II, the Fed was printing money like crazy to pay for the war. Left uncontrolled, prices would have gone through the roof, and so they imposed price controls, in particular on wages as well. And so companies, to attract labor, they weren't allowed to offer a raise, so they said, okay, well, we'll pay your health insurance. So the fact that we associate health care with our employers is partly a result of previous government interventions. I'm not, another example, and I understand people's frustrations with insurance companies, that my son had a minor condition that he doesn't even get any treatment for or anything, but he had a little heart murmur, and I had difficulty getting insurance. When I quit my job and I was an independent consultant, and I was just talking to insurance agents and saying, I'll pay whatever it is, I'll sign a waiver saying if it's anything to do with his heart, it's our, I just want a policy in case we get in a car accident or something. Right now he's technically uninsured, and that's crazy. And my agent was just telling me, no, there's nothing. We tried a few places, and they just didn't give us coverage, no matter how much of a premium I offered to pay, no matter how much of a deductible, like I said, waivers and so on, or they're called riders. And I couldn't figure it out. But then I was thinking probably what it is that the insurance company that it's not worth it to them. That even if I did sign something saying I won't expect you to pay me for a health issue related to his heart murmur, that if he runs up a $50,000 hospital tab because of that, wouldn't I just sue them and just go before a jury and say, look at my cute little, and my kid really is cute, and say, look at him, and the greedy insurance company said because he was born with this condition, they're not going to pay for it, and they're not going to take the insurance company, so they're not going to say, well, he signed this contract, no one's going to care, they're going to give me a huge award. And so I think it's because property rights are so insecure, and that's partly why you have these absurdities and with managed care and so on, that I think if you really did have sanctity of contract, a lot of this stuff would fall away. So to answer your question, unfortunately, I'm going to have to just dodge it because I don't know enough to give you a decent answer. But what I certainly can say is, if you want to control costs, why in the world would you say, let's have politicians control it? That's crazy. Like the Pentagon is a single-payer system. Do we think the Pentagon keeps costs low? I mean, it's just insane to think costs are escalating, we don't like service, let's have the government take over. When the scandal under the last few years has been the Veterans Hospital, and with rats running around and things. And I mean, and we say let's give the politicians more control over our health care. To me, that's crazy. But I can't really give you how do we get out of it because I don't know enough of the details. Yes, sir.
Your presentation today ends about 1946. I was born in 1947, so.
So maybe you were the reason we got out of the Depression.
That's my premise. The highest income tax rate, corporate income tax rate, I believe, was about 92-94% in the war, for obvious reasons. And I believe that the reason we came out of the Great Depression at that point was because government then decided, well, the war's over, we can lower taxes. And the reason, though, that we really didn't get to a good prosperous place till about Reagan's time was that we were real slow in lowering those rates, and we have about 36 or something now as the maximum tax rate. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, can that progress continue from 36% to 33 to 32? And can that make things better? Or do you think we're going to raise taxes in 2011 and start the upward trend towards the end?
So the question is...
can you read the future?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll let you know. So just so you know, if you look at a graph of the top marginal income tax rate, it was very low during the 20s, and I explained this in the book, that Andrew Mellon under Calvin Coolidge started drastically cutting tax rates. He was actually anticipating the Laffer curve by several decades there, like even his logic behind that, he thought that it would bring in more revenue. And then during the 1980s. And other than that, tax rates are much higher. So I think, to answer your question, yeah, I think tax rates are going to continue to go up. I mean, just because really the thing is how much government is spending. And they, just for those of you who don't realize this, the Congressional Budget Office recently looked at the Obama administration's 10-year budget plan, and they scored it, and they said that they thought the national debt as a share of the economy right now is about 40%, and they thought after 10 years it would be up to 80%. Right, so that the national debt as a share of GDP would double in 10 years. And this is the same CBO that when Bush got elected said they thought there'd be $5 trillion in surpluses. Right? So a lot of people say, well, yeah, so you can't trust them, they're crazy. I don't think that's what's happening. I think as wrong, as rosy and optimistic as they were when Bush came in and thought, don't worry, we'll have $5 trillion in surpluses, that's how optimistic I think they're being when they say that Obama's plans will only double the national debt. I think it's going to be a lot more because they're assuming we'll get out of this recession, in the nelet me just very briefly, why am I so pessimistic? Because I forgot, I said I was going to get into this. Very quickly, why do I think this is going to be really bad? When I say that unemployment's not going to get up to 25% because we don't have you don't have that conjunction of things where wages are rigid and prices are going to be falling, even though they fell a few months ago. I think Ben Bernanke has pumped in so much money. For me, I'm worried about price inflation. Okay, so that's the one silver lining that is you're not going to have massive unemployment because workers' wages are going to buy less and less, and so workers are going to become cheaper. So they're going to be employed. They're just not going to be able to buy anything with the grocery store. So, why am I so pessimistic? Why I think that are there green shoots? Are we going to pull out of this in the next 6 months? Have we hit the bottom? If you had asked me 3 years ago, I said, Bob, you're an economist. Just come up, hypothetically speaking. I want you to say what would happen if you want to get stagflation. Really high unemployment. Just awful economy and high inflation, what could you do? I would have thought it would be cheating if you allowed me to say, well, I suppose the Fed could double the monetary base in 6 months. The government could, take over the banks, take over 2 car companies, take over healthcare, threaten cap and trade over the entire energy industry, raise taxes, and how about they borrow $1.8 trillion in 1 year? right, I would have thought I would be cheating to answer the question that way, to how could I wreck the economy? But that's what they've done, right? And so, I mean, if you believe in free markets at all, I don't understand why more free market economists aren't as pessimistic. I mean, when people ask me how bad is it going to be, I just kind of say really bad. I mean, I don't, you know, in other words, what more could the government do to destroy the economy than the sorts of things they've been doing? And when you take over the banks, that's a long-term thing. It's not like if they, you know, put price controls on haircuts, you would see the problem right away. You know, you'd see, oh, there'd be shortages. But when you take over the bank, because banks, they direct capital to where it ought to go. And so, I mean, that screws up long-term investment and this coordination that Tom talked about. So that's something that isn't going to really manifest itself until a few years into it. That investments that should have been started now are not going to be started now. And so where our economy will be 3 years from now is going to be much lower than where it would have been had the proper investments been made, you know, in the last 6 months. So that's why I'm so pessimistic.
Let's do one more.
Okay, sir, one more question.
Unless you're a complete cynic, you have to believe, I guess, that the present administration really is focused and intent on solving the economic problem. How did that camp and this group, our beliefs, end up so different? How did we misinterpret history so that it can be so polar opposite? And then the last little tag to that is, are economists generally as divided as politicians?
Okay.
On this thing?
All right, so first of all, let me perhaps be the cynic. It's because a lot of Republicans come up to me and they say, "Oh, this is, you know, don't worry, it's going to be awful, but we'll be like Jimmy Carter. Obama's going to be a one-termer because he's going to screw things up so bad." I said, "Okay, but FDR was a 3 or 4 termer, and he had the worst economy in U.S. history, or I guess Hoover did." Right? So it's not clear to me, if you're Obama and you're a wonderful speaker, it actually might be a good strategy to keep people terrified and thinking, you need me at the helm to guide us through this. Because I'm just like FDR. He guided us through it the last time. You need me in charge. So I think it's probably true that Democrats might lose, you know, significant portions of Congress. But I actually think if you just want to get reelected and you're Barack Obama, I'm not sure you want to fix things anytime soon. But the broader question is, we're so sure we're right, they're so sure they're right. How is that possible? Very quickly, I think part of it is you can't really have a controlled experiment in economics. So because I think free markets work better, and I don't think printing up green pieces of paper makes us richer, I can look at the 30s and say, look, they tried deficit spending. The Fed tried lowering interest rates after the stock market crash, and they tried propping up banks, and look what happened. Whereas somebody who's really committed to big government deficit spending can say, well, no, what happened is the reason 1938 was such a bad year is FDR actually raised taxes a little bit, and that lowered the deficit, right? So, or Herbert Hoover raised taxes and cut spending a tiny little bit in 1932, and so the deficit dropped a little sliver. And so they say, see, and so if you're just absolutely committed to that's what the problem, or they say, you're crazy, Dr. Murphy. Look at all the big government spending of World War II, and that's when we got out of the Depression, so how can you sit there and say big spending isn't the solution? It obviously is, and you're just an ideologue for ignoring the lessons of history. So the point is, it's really hard to look at history and say, what does it teach us? You need to have a theory to parse things and to look at what the cause and effect is in your mind. And so I think that's part of the problem. Okay, so I guess that's it. Thank you.